They said I'd never be rich selling shoes. They said dreams like mine belonged in basements, not boardrooms. That night I smiled through their laughter and memorized every word, every glance, every smirk across that polished table. Because sometimes the people who mock you the loudest aren't your enemies, they're your family. And sometimes the only way to silence them is not to argue, but to build something so undeniable that even their pride can't look away. That was the night I decided I'd make them eat their words one shoe at a time. The Bennett family dinners were never about warmth. They were performances, rehearsed smiles, expensive wine, the illusion of unity draped over decades of quiet resentment. My father, Harold Bennett, sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over his favorite trial. My brother Evan played the golden air, confident, loud, magnetic. And me, I was the misstep in their perfect lineage, the daughter who chose design over real business. The room shimmered with precision across the ornate plates and the tension between us. My mother Eleanor passed around the baked apple pie, smiling too tightly, as if sweetness could soften what was coming. I already knew the script. It never changed. Dinner wasn't about food, it was about hierarchy. So Clara, my father, began swirling his wine still, doing that little shoe thing. His tone stretched the word little until it snapped. Across the table, Evan chuckled. "You mean the hobby? Yeah, I saw her website. Cute stuff, sis. Handmade shoes for a handful of buyers. That's adorable." Laughter rolled around the table like a well-timed cue. Even Eleanor let out a small nervous giggle, the kind that says, "Please don't make this worse." I sliced my pie steady, my fork scraping softly against porcelain. "It's not a hobby," I said. My voice was calm. I'd learned that silence, not shouting, often lands clean. It's a brand. Evan leaned back, smirking. "A brand. You sell shoes from your apartment." Dad joined in his reflection, glinting in the wine glass. "Hard work's admirable, Clara, but there's a difference between a dream and a delusion. No one gets rich sewing shoes." I felt their words hit sharp, precise, meant to remind me where I stood. But I didn't flinch. I smiled instead. That same quiet smile I'd perfected years ago, small enough to seem harmless, strong enough to survive their pity. "Maybe," I said softly, "you just haven't found the right shoes yet." The laughter returned louder this time. Aunt Lorna, always eager to side with the powerful, tapped her glass. "She's got spirit, Harold. Maybe she'll surprise us all one day." My father chuckled. "Surprises don't pay bills, Lorna." I stared at the flicker of candlelight. Resolve coiled quietly in my chest. That was me, I thought. Contained, small, but insistent. Beneath the table, I clenched my hands until my nails pressed half-moons into my palm. I'd learned long ago that showing pain only made them press harder. So I didn't. I let their scornful laughter become fuel, every word adding weight to the promise building quietly in my chest. "You know," Evan added between bites, "if you ever get tired of whatever that is, I could talk to my firm. Maybe they'd find you something stable." Stable. That word again. It followed me like a ghost. It meant predictable. Safe. Small. "I appreciate it," I said, "but I'm good where I am." Dad raised his eyebrows, as if amused by my defiance. "Pride doesn't buy property, Clara. You can't build a future on fantasies." I met his gaze. For once, I didn't look away. "Neither can you build it on fear." The table went quiet. The kind of silence that hums sharp and alive like a wire pulled too tight. Eleanor coughed, breaking it. "Let's just enjoy the meal," she murmured. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. For years I'd wanted to belong at that table, to be seen as more than the family disappointment, the daughter who refused to follow the script. But sitting there watching their smug smiles fade under their own arrogance, I realized something. I didn't need to belong there. I needed to build my own table. When dessert was cleared, my father leaned back smug. "You're smart, Clara. If you ever want to make real money, you know where to find me. Bennett Leatherworks still has your name on it if you're willing to work under someone who actually knows business." I looked at him, the man who built an empire just to watch it crumble under ego. "No thanks," I said. "I think I'll build something new. Something you can't take credit for." Evan laughed. "Selling shoes." "Sure, sis. Call me when you've made your first million." I smiled without warmth again. "I will." They didn't know that I meant it. That night, as rain streaked across the car windows and the glow of the Bennett estate faded in my rearview mirror, I whispered the words out loud for the first time. "I'll show them." The radio hummed softly. My hands tightened on the wheel. Every insult replayed in my head, not as wounds, but as blueprints. Every laugh became a nail in the foundation of something they'd never understand, something that didn't need their approval to exist. When I reached my tiny apartment, the air was thick with work and polish. My workbench waited cluttered, imperfect, alive. I set my coat aside, tied my hair, and picked up a half-finished shoe. The stitching was uneven, the color off the form still rough. But it was mine. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, I worked until the first light of dawn touched the floor. That dinner broke me just enough to rebuild differently. And as I held that worn piece of leather in my hands, I made myself a promise. If the world refused to open its doors, I'd carve my own wearing the very shoes they said would never make me rich. I grew up in a house where dreams were measured in paychecks and worth was defined by profit margins. My father used to say, "A man's success is the weight of his wallet." I was never a man, and I never cared about wallets. Maybe that was my first mistake. The Bennett house looked perfect from the outside, crisp white siding, trimmed hedges, a porch swing that creaked softly on summer nights. But underneath all that polish, it was a place where ambition was currency and affection came with terms. My father, Harold, had built Bennett Leatherworks from the ground up, or so he liked to remind everyone. By the time I was born, his business was already fading, but he held on to it like a badge of pride, refusing to admit that time had changed, and so had the world. Evan, my older brother, inherited that pride like a family heirloom. He walked through life with the certainty of someone who'd never been told no. Every A on his report card went up on the hallway wall, framed in polished wood. My drawings, my designs, my first sketches of shoes, they ended up in a kitchen drawer, out of sight. Dad would pat my shoulder and say, "That's nice, Clara. But art doesn't build empires." When I was 12, I found an old sewing machine in the basement my mother Eleanor's tucked behind boxes of unused leather scraps from the factory. I started experimenting with it after school, patching together bits of leftover material into shapes that almost looked like shoes. They were uneven, rough, more imagination than craft, but when I slipped one on, I felt something I never felt upstairs: freedom. The basement became my world, concrete floor, dim light, the hum of the old machine. I'd sit there for hours, breathing in the scent of effort lingered, pretending I was designing for someone who mattered. Sometimes I imagined customers walking into my own little shop, smiling as they tried on what I'd made. Upstairs, dinner was being served on fine china. Down here, I was feeding something else, something raw and stubborn. One evening, my father came looking for me. His footsteps echoed down the basement stairs, each one like a countdown. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, voice sharp, curious, but already disappointed. I showed him the shoes, uneven stitches, mismatched colors, but I was proud of them. "Look, I said I made them from your leftover scraps." He picked one up, turned it in his hands, then dropped it back onto the table. "You're wasting your time, Clara. Leatherwork is about precision, not play. Leave this to people who know what they're doing." "But I want to learn," I said. My voice cracked, but I stood my ground. He sighed heavy with that kind of pity that sounds almost like disgust. "You want to learn, fine. Learn something that pays. Business accounting, not sewing. That's labor, not leadership." He left me there in the dim light, the smell of disappointment thicker than the glue on my hands. From that day, the basement became both my refuge and my rebellion. Every night I snuck down there after homework when everyone was asleep. The hum of the sewing machine became my lullaby. I taught myself through trial and error, broken needles, burnt fingers, pricked thumbs. I learned that leather is like people. Too much pressure and it cracks too little, and it never holds shape. In school, I stopped trying to compete with Evan. He was already the Golden Sun varsity basketball honor roll, the kind of charm that won over teachers and neighbors. My wins were smaller, quieter. The day I made my first perfect stitch, I ran upstairs to show Eleanor. She smiled faintly, patted my cheek. "That's nice, honey, but you should really think about college applications. You're not getting younger." When I turned 17, I entered a local craft fair without telling anyone. I displayed 3 pairs of handmade shoes under a cardboard sign that read, "Designed by Clara Bennett." People stopped, admired, and asked questions. A woman bought a pair for $40. My first sale. I remember running home holding that cash like it was sacred. When I told Dad, he chuckled. $40. That won't even cover the gas it took to get there. He didn't understand it wasn't the money. It was proof that someone outside this house saw value in something I made. That tiny exchange felt more validating than every good girl I'd ever heard growing up. That summer, the factory closed. Dad blamed the economy, the workers, the government, never himself. Our house grew quieter, the pride dimming in the corners. He'd spend nights sitting at the kitchen table staring into a glass of bourbon. Evan went off to college on a scholarship. I stayed home saving for design school. Dad didn't approve. "Fashion is fickle," he said. "You'll end up broke, begging for help." I didn't argue anymore. I just listened and memorized. When I finally left for design school, I took the sewing machine with me. It was old, loud, and missing one of the knobs, but it worked. My first dorm roommate complained about the noise. "It's 2 a.m, Clara," she groaned. "Why can't you just draw like normal people?" "Because sketches fade. Stitches last." I worked through every break, every holiday. I spent Christmases alone in the studio while others went home. I told myself I was fine, and for the most part, I was. Until the call came. Dad's voice was colder than usual. "Your brother's graduating this spring. He's got a job lined up at a real firm. Maybe it's time you came home. This design thing, it's not the future." I looked at my desk at the half-finished prototype glowing under the lamp and felt something inside me harden. "I can't, Dad," I said. "I'm not done yet." He laughed. "Not done wasting your time, you mean?" When the line went dead, I sat there for a long time. Then I turned the sewing machine back on. That was the moment I realized the world upstairs could collapse. But down here in the hum of the machine, the rhythm of the needle, the scent of raw leather, I could build something new. Something that didn't need anyone's permission to exist. I wasn't born into power or privilege. I was born in a basement, and I decided that was enough. The morning I left home, the air felt heavy, thick with everything unsaid. My father, Harold, was at the kitchen table, the same place he always sat when he needed to remind the world he was right. The newspaper was open, untouched. The smell of yesterday's indifference lingered. My duffel bag sat by the door, half-zipped, Eleanor's silence hovering beside it like a ghost. "You're really doing this," my father said without looking up. His tone wasn't surprising. It was finality. The kind he used when closing a deal. "Yes," I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. He folded the paper with surgical precision. "And what exactly are you chasing, Clara Shoes, Dreams likes?" "On the internet, freedom," I said. He laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, which somehow hurt worse. "Freedom doesn't pay rent." I met his eyes. "Neither does pride, Dad." That landed. For the first time, he looked at me, really looked. His jaw tightened. "You want to learn the hard way? Fine. Don't come running back when reality hits you." My mother, Eleanor, stepped forward, her hands trembling. "At least take the car," she whispered. "It's old, but it'll get you where you need to go." The car, a silver Civic my father hated, sat in the driveway like a forgotten relic. It had one headlight out, a cracked mirror, and an engine that coughed before starting, but at that moment it looked like salvation. I slung the bag over my shoulder, nodded once, and walked out. My father didn't follow. I closed the door behind me, and it slammed like punctuation at the end of a long, bitter sentence. I drove until the town shrank behind me, the skyline fading into gray. The further I went, the quieter my thoughts became. By the time I reached Portland, the sky had opened up into a steady drizzle, the kind that seemed to wash everything clean, even regret. The apartment I rented wasn't much. One room peeling paint, a kitchenette smaller than my father's liquor cabinet. But it was mine. I set the sewing machine on a shaky table by the window, unpacked the scraps of leather I'd smuggled from the factory, and whispered to myself, "Let's begin." The first weeks were brutal. I worked the morning shift at a cafe scrubbing tables, forcing my lips into a practiced smile, my fingers aching from both coffee cups and stitches. At night, I'd sit by that window, the hum of traffic below the sharp tang of solvents, and hide thick in the air and sew until my eyes blurred. Sometimes I'd hold a finished shoe in my hand and wonder if I was insane. Who was I kidding, trying to build a life from something my family called a hobby? But then I'd slip my foot into the leather-soft, imperfect alive, and I'd remember why I started. The first sale came by accident. I'd listed a pair of ankle boots on a small online marketplace priced low just to test the system. They sold in less than a day. $600. I stared at the notification on my cracked phone screen until it blurred. It wasn't the amount, it was the validation. Someone somewhere had seen my work and decided it was worth something. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not even my roommate. I just kept working. There were nights when the power went out and I'd keep sewing by candlelight. Days when my hands bled from needle pricks. Times when the bills stacked higher than the orders. But each pair of shoes told a story of persistence, of defiance, of something growing quietly in the shadows. Every Friday, I'd drive to the post office with boxes piled in the Civic, praying the car would make it. The clerk started recognizing me. More shoes, he'd ask, grinning. More hope, I'd reply. Still, the loneliness crept in sometimes, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep. I'd scroll through social media watching Evan post pictures from corporate retreats and office parties, his suits sharp, his smiles sharper. My father commented under every post, "Proud of my boy." No comments under mine. No messages. No calls. Just silence. A silence that grew heavier each day. One night, loneliness broke me. I called home. My mother, Eleanor, answered. "Mom," I said softly, "I made a sale." "That's nice, honey," she replied, her voice distant. "Your father's asleep. Evan just got promoted." I hung up before the tears could fall. After that, I stopped calling. Months passed. My little shop, if you could call it that, started gaining a following. Customers began posting pictures, tagging my work and sharing my designs. Every message felt like a tiny spark in the dark. "You made me feel beautiful." These shoes changed how I walk. I wore them to my wedding. Each one reminded me that what I was doing mattered. Then came the message that changed everything. A boutique owner in Seattle had seen my work online. She wanted to stock 10 pairs, handcrafted, unique, with soul, she wrote. I read that line over and over. With soul. That night I worked until dawn. My hands trembled with exhaustion, but my heart felt steady. I didn't know how I'd afford the materials or the time, but I didn't care. For the first time, the future didn't scare me. One morning after dropping off the shipment at the bus depot, I sat in the Civic and just breathed. The city stretched before me, rough, loud, alive. My palms still smelled like leather, my clothes like glue, but my spirit was clean. I looked at the empty passenger seat beside me and whispered, "You were wrong, Dad. This isn't failure. It's the start of something." A week later, I received an email from the boutique. Every pair had sold out in 2 days. I laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep inside, the kind that feels like defiance wrapped in joy. That night I went home, opened my small fridge, and poured myself a glass of cheap wine. I lifted it toward the window, toward the glowing city beyond. To every no I ever heard, I whispered, "Thank you." Because without them, I'd never have found my own yes. There's a certain kind of quiet that only exists at 2 a.m, the kind where the city hums like a tired machine, and you're the only one still fighting to make something out of nothing. Those were my nights. My days belonged to customers at the cafe, but my nights belonged to the basement apartment and the sound of the sewing machine. The walls were thin, cracked, and damp. When it rained, the smell of the city leaked in wet asphalt oil loneliness. But in that tiny space, under the dull yellow glow of a streetlight outside my window, I built worlds out of scraps. Rolls of leather leaned against the wall, mismatched threads tangled like veins across the floor. I didn't have fancy tools, just stubborn hands, and the conviction that one day someone would care about what they stepped into. My roommate Lydia thought I was insane. She worked at an accounting firm and came home every night exhausted, her heels clicking across the tile like punctuation marks. "You're going to burn yourself out, Clara," she'd say, watching me sketch at the kitchen table. "I can rest when it works," I'd tell her. She rolled her eyes, but she helped me anyway. When orders began to trickle in, 2 one week, 5 the next, she packed boxes with me, writing thank you notes in her neat handwriting. "You're too shy to sell yourself," she'd tease. "People should know the story behind these shoes." I didn't think anyone cared about stories back then. I was wrong. One night a woman named Ava left a comment under one of my posts. "These feel alive," she wrote, "like someone cared about every stitch." It was only a sentence, but it felt like oxygen. I printed that comment and taped it above my sewing table. Every time I wanted to quit, I looked at those words and reminded myself why I started. The apartment was small, but dreams have a way of taking up space. My sketches began creeping across the walls, outlines of heels, loafers, boots, ideas that I couldn't afford to make yet, but refused to abandon. When the lights flickered, I'd light a candle and keep going. When my fingers blistered, I'd wrap them in tape and keep stitching. One night, Lydia came home to find me asleep at the machine, a half-finished shoe still clamped under the needle. She draped a blanket over my shoulders and whispered, "You're going to make it, Clara. I can feel it." I wanted to believe her. Then the break came, the kind of accident that only happens once in a lifetime. Lydia had posted a picture of one of my designs online, tagging me without telling me. Within hours, it started spreading. A local influencer, someone with hundreds of thousands of followers, shared it with the caption, "Why does this handmade brand make me emotional?" The next morning, I woke up to over 200 new messages. The small marketplace page I'd built overnight was flooded with orders. By the end of the week, I had 300 pairs to make, more than I'd ever dreamed possible. I remember staring at the screen, disbelief washing over me. Lydia was jumping on the couch, laughing. "You did it. You're going viral." But all I could think was, how will I fill these? I didn't have enough leather tools or even space to keep up. But I wasn't about to turn away the first miracle that had ever knocked on my door. We turned the apartment into a factory. The coffee table became a cutting station. The couch became storage. Lydia packed boxes while I sewed until dawn. We barely slept. My fingertips were raw, my eyes bloodshot, but every new confirmation email felt like a pulse proof that I was alive, that my work mattered. That's when Vivian Hart came into the picture. I was at the cafe, bleary-eyed and half awake, when she walked in, elegant mid-50s, the kind of woman who carried power without needing to announce it. She ordered black coffee and sat near the window. I didn't notice her watching me until she spoke. "You're Clara Bennett," she said. "I recognize you from the photo online." "The shoes." I froze. "You've seen them?" Her lips curved slightly. "I've bought 3 pairs. She slid a card across the table. "Vivian Hart, independent investor, Hart and Willow Ventures. I used to run a fashion house," she said. "Then I learned real innovation happens in places like yours, where people build with their hands, not their egos." I must have looked stunned because she smiled. "You remind me of who I was before I learned to be careful." "Don't lose that." That night we met in my apartment. She sat on a folding chair surrounded by stacks of boxes and scraps of leather. "You're doing everything right," she said, "except killing yourself to do it alone. Let me help you." I hesitated. I'd built this from the ground up. The thought of letting anyone in terrified me. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," she said. "Just a small investment, and to see what happens when a woman who refuses to quit finally has the tools she deserves." It wasn't charity, it was faith. We signed the papers 2 weeks later. With Vivian's help, I rented a tiny workshop, 4 walls, 1 window, 2 assistants. For the first time, I didn't have to choose between exhaustion and creation. The first day in that workshop, I stood in the middle of the room and closed my eyes. The air was thick with work and polish, smelling like possibility. I whispered to myself, "This is the beginning." That night, I sent Lydia a message. "We did it. We're official." She replied with a shot of the streetlight outside our old window. The caption read, "You built this under that light. Never forget it." I didn't. Even now, when I think about those years, the noise, the hunger, the sleepless nights, I realize they weren't just the struggle. They were the spark. The world above me might have been asleep, but down in that small apartment under that flickering streetlight, I was awake, building a dream no one else could see yet. The day it happened started like any other: too much coffee, not enough sleep, and the faint scent of effort lingered, clinging to everything I owned. I'd just finished boxing the last pair of shoes for shipment when my phone buzzed. I didn't ignore the notification this time. The online marketplace had exploded with requests after Lydia's post went viral, turning an overwhelming success into a logistical nightmare. Orders piled higher than the boxes. I was drowning in the very thing I'd prayed for. The turning point came one afternoon when Vivian Hart appeared at the door. I was working out of the small workshop, hand-cutting leather, exhausted. She didn't knock. She just stood there watching me work. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and commanding. "You're Clara Bennett." I straightened slowly. "I am." "I'm Vivian Hart," she said, extending her hand. "Hart and Willow Ventures." I recognized the look of a woman who needs infrastructure more than sleep. I hesitated before shaking it. Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp, the kind of gaze that saw through people and into purpose. "I've been watching your rise," she said. "Your designs, your message, your resilience. You're what the industry pretends to celebrate but rarely supports." I didn't know what to say, so I gestured awkwardly toward the half-finished boots on my table. "This is what I do," I can see that she replied, walking around the room. "But you're burning yourself out trying to do everything alone." She stopped by the wall where I'd pinned sketches. "This one," she said, pointing to a minimalist sandal design. "This could be a signature." "Do you have investors?" I laughed under my breath. "Investors? I barely have consistent electricity." Vivian smiled slightly. "Then maybe it's time you did." We met again later that week at a cafe downtown. She was early, of course. People like her always are. She had a folder already open when I arrived. Spreadsheets projected growth charts, cost breakdowns. "You have something rare," she said. "A brand with soul. People are craving authenticity and you're giving it to them." "I don't know how to run a company," I admitted. "Then learn," she said simply. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll mentor you, invest in your infrastructure, get you a proper workspace. You'll keep creative control. I only ask for a small equity share and the promise that you won't stop believing in yourself halfway through." It didn't sound like a deal. It sounded like a lifeline. By the end of the meeting, I was shaking her hand, my throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Build something worthy of the faith I'm placing in you. Then we'll celebrate." The following month was a blur. With Vivian's help, I found a small brick and glass studio downtown, sunlight streaming through the windows, the air smelling of cedar and polish. For the first time, I could see my dream take physical form. A sign went up on the door, "La Rev Handmade." I stood in the center of the empty studio, clutching the signed agreement. This wasn't charity and it wasn't a bailout. This was a belief. All my life, I'd wanted someone to rescue me from the Bennett's judgment. But Vivian hadn't saved me. She'd simply seen the fortress I was already building and handed me a better foundation. The difference, the realization that my own effort was what earned this trust, was more validating than $1 million. The day we opened, Lydia brought flowers, wild sunflowers, from a roadside stand. "They suit you," she said, arranging them in an old glass jar. Stubborn. Beautiful. Hard to kill. Orders poured in faster than we could handle. The local press wrote about the woman who turned leather into luxury. I gave my first interview nervous but proud. When the journalist asked what inspired the name Le Rêve, I told her it means the dream, because that's all I had when I started. The article went viral again this time with a headline that made me cry from basement to boutique, the dream behind Le Rêve. I printed that headline and taped it next to Ava's comment on my wall. Two reminders, the beginning and the spark that changed everything. But not everything was easy. For every success came new challenges, supply issues, delayed shipments, copycat brands, stealing my designs. I was learning that growth came with a price exhaustion doubt and a fear that I'd lose myself in the noise. One night after everyone had left, I sat in the darkened workshop, the hum of the city faint outside. I stared at my hands, cracked, tired, covered in ink and glue, and whispered, "Don't forget who you are." Vivian stopped by the next morning. She found me still there, sketchbook open. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Can't stop," I admitted. She smiled knowingly. "Good. But remember, success without rest is just another kind of failure." Then she reached into her bag and handed me a small box. Inside was a gold pin shaped like a feather. It was my first company symbol, she said. It reminded me to stay light even when things got heavy. "You'll need it." I held it carefully, my throat tight. "Thank you." She nodded. "Now go make something that lasts." I pinned the feather above my work table that night. The city lights flickered through the window, glinting off the gold. Reflections trembled across the rim of the glass. That was the first time I let myself believe I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning. The spark had caught, and this time, I wasn't afraid of the fire. It had been almost 3 years since I walked out of my parents' house with a duffel bag and a dream. 3 years since my father's words, "Selling shoes will never make you rich," became the voice that pushed me through every sleepless night. And now I had everything I'd once prayed for: a thriving business, loyal customers, and a team that believed in what we were building. But when I went home for dinner that winter, I made sure to drive the same battered Civic that coughed smoke every time it started. Clara, my mother. Eleanor said when she opened the door, her tone equal parts surprise and caution. The smell of baked apples drifted from the kitchen. "We didn't think you'd make it." I smiled without warmth, politely. "It gets me where I need to go." The laughter rolled across the room, practiced and sharp. I'd learned long ago that silence was my best shield. Dinner was always the same: roasted chicken, apple pie, and conversation that felt more like performance than warmth. Evan talked about corporate takeovers and vacation homes. My father boasted about his investments. Every time I opened my mouth, someone interrupted. So Clara, Aunt Lorna, finally said, her voice dripping with curiosity, "Are you still making those little shoes in your workshop?" I set down my fork slowly. "Yes," I said. "Actually, we just expanded. We're opening a second studio soon." The silence that followed was thin and brief. "That's nice, dear," Lorna said, waving a dismissive hand. "But do you ever think about something more stable? A real career?" Evan chuckled. "You should come work for me, Clara. We always need people who understand retail." The insult was routine, but tonight it felt different. I glanced at the silver Civic in the driveway in my mind's eye. They still saw the car. They didn't see the woman who chose to drive it. I felt a strange, quiet triumph, a form of imposter peace. I was sitting there, a millionaire, letting them believe I was still their failure, and their smug certainty was my private fortress. I smiled without warmth, nodding. Maybe someday. When dessert came, my father lifted his glass. "To success," he said, his voice firm and sure. "May we all continue to make choices that bring pride to this family." Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me. That night, as I drove back to the city, the cold air bit through my coat, but a pulse of heat under calm began to build in my chest. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was resolved. I whispered to the empty car, "You'll see. One day, you'll all see." The following months blurred into long hours and quiet triumphs. Le Rêve was thriving. Fashion editors began reaching out. Celebrities wore our designs. But I stayed quiet. I let the brand speak louder than my name. One afternoon, Vivian stopped by the studio. She leaned against the counter watching as I oversaw the new line, soft leathers in muted tones, minimalist, elegant. "You're hiding, you know," she said. I looked up from my sketchbook. "Hiding, you're letting the world fall in love with your work, but not you. At some point, you'll have to step into the light, Clara." "I'm not ready," I said. She smiled knowingly. "You're not scared of the spotlight. You're scared of what your family will think when they realize they were wrong." She wasn't wrong. I'd spent years building a fortress out of silence, and success had become my secret rebellion. My father's voice, his dismissive tone, his smug certainty had fueled every pair of shoes I ever made. And I wasn't ready to give up the satisfaction of knowing he still thought I was struggling. That illusion cracked one evening when a journalist called the studio. "We're preparing a feature on modern luxury brands," she said. "Your name came up more than once. Would you be open to an interview?" My heart stuttered. Modern luxury. It sounded foreign. Dangerous. "I'll think about it," I said. But that night, lying in bed, I imagined my father's face reading my name in print, and I knew I wasn't ready to let him see it. Not yet. So I turned it down. Again and again I declined features, deflected interviews, and let the work speak for itself. Until one call I couldn't ignore. It came from Harper's Luxe, a top fashion magazine. The editor herself, poised, polished, and unrelenting. "Clara, we're running a cover story on independent women redefining the luxury market," she said. "We want you." My mouth went dry. The cover? Yes. "You're not just a designer anymore. You're a symbol of authenticity in a world obsessed with excess. People want to know who you are." The next morning I told Vivian. She grinned. "Well, it's about time. You can't hide forever." The photo shoot was surreal, flashes of light makeup brushes, assistants whispering, "She's incredible." When they showed me the proof, I barely recognized myself. Not because of the makeup or lighting, but because for the first time my reflection no longer waited for approval. The issue dropped 2 weeks later. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Friends, colleagues, even old customers flooded my inbox. One message stood out, though. From Evan. "Saw your magazine cover. Guess the shoe business isn't so small after all." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Guess not." Then nothing for days. Until my father finally called. "I saw the article," he said, his voice careful, controlled. "You've done well." "Thank you," I said simply. He cleared his throat. "You should visit more often. The family would like that." "I will," I lied, because deep down I knew the truth. They didn't want me there for who I was. They wanted to rewrite the story now that it suited them, and I wasn't ready to give them that power. So I hung up, locked my phone, and went back to work. Outside, the city lights gleamed against the glass, reflecting back a version of me I'd built piece by piece, not for them, but for me. The mask of modesty was still in place, but underneath it, the truth was getting harder to contain. The invitation arrived not on cream stationery, but as a formal email forwarding from Vivian's assistant. "Annual Portland Arts and Culture Gala. Your brand is sponsoring a table." My father Harold had secured a last-minute seat for the Bennetts, clearly seeing an opportunity. A year ago, I would have worn a borrowed dress. Today, I wore a bespoke Le Rêve gown and a practiced smile all edges. The ballroom shimmered with precision. Crystal chimes and soft, expensive chatter. I was seated at Vivian's head table, but I saw them across the room, Harold, Eleanor, and Evan looking stiff in the overly ornate setting. When they finally approached during the champagne reception, the mood was thick with forced pleasantry. "Clara," Harold said, his voice measured, "we didn't know you'd be here." "I'm sponsoring a table, Dad," I replied simply. Evan's eyes flicked over my dress, sharp and assessing. "Smart move. Exposure is key. Still running that little shoe shop?" "Something like that," I said, taking a sip of champagne. The tension was broken by Aunt Lorna gliding over wearing an expression of strained curiosity. "Clara, darling, you look... well, is that really your brand featured in the magazine Harper's Luxe?" Before I could answer, my father interjected, his voice too smooth. Featured doesn't mean successful, Lorna. Exposure doesn't pay the bills. Evan raised his glass. To exposure, then. At least she's famous somewhere. I felt a quiet, insistent heat in my chest. Their words landed clean but failed to pierce the resolve coiled quietly within me. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled, letting their low expectations remain in their prison. Halfway through the lunch, the main speaker paused, announcing a moment for corporate sponsors. We'd like to give a special thank you to our newest patron, the innovative luxury house Le Rêve, and its visionary CEO, Clara Bennett, for their generous contribution to this year's Arts Fund. The entire ballroom applauded. I stood and acknowledged the crowd with a nod. Across the room, I watched Harold and Evan's faces turn pale. The look wasn't disappointment. It was the sudden, sickening realization that they were the supporting cast in my play. When I returned to my table, the phone in my lap buzzed. A message from my assistant, Lena. Forbes confirmation came early. The article is live. I looked at the glowing screen. Luxury brand CEO of the year, the woman who redefined elegance. I glanced across the room one last time. They were huddled, staring at their phones, their silence heavier than any insult. I didn't need to tell them anything. The world has done it for me. The laughter around the table was still echoing when my father Harold's phone buzzed against the silver tray beside his plate. At first he ignored it, slicing through his roast, as if nothing in the world could interrupt his own story. But the buzzing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until even Evan glanced over with mild irritation. Dad sighed, muttering something under his breath, and picked it up. "Excuse me," he said, pressing the phone to his ear. "Yes, this is Richard Bennett." I didn't look up. I was still tracing the edge of my fork against my plate, my heart steady and slow. But I could feel that shift in the air, subtle and invisible, like the moment before a storm breaks. Dad's voice changed. The practiced authority softened into something thinner. Yes, that's my daughter." Silence. Evan frowned. "What's wrong?" My father didn't answer. He lowered the phone slowly, his face pale. For a man who prided himself on control, the flicker of confusion in his eyes was startling. Finally he said, "It was my colleague from the firm. He asked if my daughter was Clara Bennett from Forbes." The words dropped like glass, shattering on tile. For a second, no one moved. The clinking of silverware, the murmured laughter, all gone. Eleanor's hand froze mid-air, her fork suspended above her plate. Aunt Lorna blinked rapidly as though she hadn't heard correctly. Evan was the first to break the silence. From Forbes, he repeated, his tone caught somewhere between disbelief and mockery. "What do you mean?" Dad's gaze moved to me, sharp and uncertain. Apparently he said the word thick in his throat. Forbes just published an article about Clara. She's been named Luxury Brand CEO of the Year. The air cracked. Evan laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "That's ridiculous. There must be another Clara Bennett. It's not exactly a unique name." But Dad didn't answer him. He just stared at me, the way you might look at something you thought you understood only to realize you'd been wrong all along. I met his gaze calmly. "It's true." The silence stretched heavy and unrelenting. Every face around that table turned toward me, a dozen expressions collapsing at once. Shock, confusion, embarrassment. Eleanor was the first to speak. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why didn't you tell us? I took my time setting down my glass." "Because you never asked." The room rippled with unease. Evan leaned forward, his composure cracking. "You're saying you're what, a CEO? Now? You expect us to believe that—" "I don't expect anything," I said softly. "But you might want to check the headlines before dessert." Dad's hand shook as he picked up his phone again, fumbling with the screen. Eleanor reached for hers. Within seconds, the glow of their devices painted their faces in cold light. Then came the collective gasp, quiet but unmistakable. The headline landed clean for everyone to see. From basement to billion-dollar brand, Clara Bennett, CEO of Le Rêve, redefines luxury. Evan's fork clattered against his plate. Aunt Lorna's mouth fell open, words dying on her tongue. "You built that," my father said, finally his voice cracking. "Yes," I said. "Every stitch, every sale, every sleepless night you laughed about." The room pulsed with silence again. It wasn't the awkward kind that filled family dinners. It was the kind that demanded reckoning. Dad cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "You should have told us." "We could have helped." "Helped," I repeated, smiling faintly. "You cut me off, remember? Said I'd never make a living selling shoes." "That was years ago," he said sharply. "You could have come back." "I did come back," I said. "You just didn't recognize me." Across the table, Evan shifted in his chair. The smugness that usually lived in his eyes was gone, replaced with something smaller. "So all this time you've been, what? Keeping it from us?" "Let us think you were struggling." "Yes," I said. "It was easier that way." The tension broke like a dam. Everyone started speaking at once, my aunts whispering, my father sputtering half-formed apologies, my mother dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Then just as suddenly, a waiter appeared, the same man who had been quietly serving dishes all evening. He leaned toward me with a professional smile. "Congratulations, Miss Bennett," he said softly. "The article went live early. The hotel staff sends their regards." The room froze again. My father turned sharply. "Miss Bennett." The waiter nodded. "Of course." Ms. Bennett reserved the private suite under her corporate account. "She's one of our premier clients." My father's face was drained of color. The waiter refilled my glass, bowed politely, and left as quietly as he'd come. I lifted the glass slowly, the bubbles rising to the surface like a quiet celebration. "To my family," I said, "and to new beginnings." No one spoke. Eleanor's voice trembled. "Clara, we didn't know, I know." I said, my tone even. "You never wanted to know." Evan swallowed hard. "So what now?" "You just get to sit there and gloat." I looked at him, my golden brother, the pride of the family, and felt something unexpected pity. "No," I said softly. "I don't need to gloat. The truth already did that for me." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Around us, the air felt charged electric. Years of dismissal, mockery, and condescension hung in that room like smoke, and for the first time they were choking on it instead of me. My father finally spoke, his voice brittle. "Clara, I'm proud of you." The words sounded foreign, almost painful for him to say. I smiled, not out of cruelty, but closure. "Thank you, Dad." But we both knew it was too late. The light spilled across the table, catching the faint shimmer of my wine glass. Reflections trembled across the rim. "For years," I said quietly, "you made me feel small. Tonight you reminded me why I stopped needing your approval." No one moved. The house, once filled with chatter and superiority, was finally silent. The clock ticked in the corner, steady and merciless, counting the seconds between who I had been and who I'd become. And for the first time in my life, the noise inside me finally stilled. It was beautiful. The moment the waiter left, the silence stretched so thick, it felt like we were all drowning in it. No one touched their food. No one moved. The laughter that had filled the room minutes before had vanished, leaving only the faint clink of the chandelier above us swaying slightly, as if the air itself had shifted. My father, Harold, was the first to break. "Clara," he said slowly, his voice trembling around the edges. "You could have told us. You didn't have to let us find out like this." I looked at him, calm but steady. "You wouldn't have believed me if I had." Eleanor's hand hovered near her wine glass. "We're proud of you," she said, though the words sounded fragile, as if they might shatter before they left her lips. Pride. That was a word I hadn't heard from her in years. Not when I'd left home. Not when my first design sold out. Not even when Le Rêve hit its first million in revenue. Only now that the whole world had validated me, was I suddenly worthy of it. Across the table, Evan sat stiffly, his face pale, jaw tight. So what, he asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "You're some kind of celebrity now. I tilted my head. I prefer entrepreneurs. His laugh was hollow. Come on, Clara. You run a shoe brand. That's not the same thing as being Forbes material. Dad turned on him sharply. That's enough. The command startled us both. Evan blinked, caught off guard, his mouth half open. Dad's voice softened as he looked back at me. I underestimated you. We all did. But you've proven yourself. Maybe we can talk about merging efforts. There's room for family collaboration in business. There it was. The pivot. From dismissal to opportunity. From insult to advantage. You want a piece of it now? I asked, my tone even. Dad frowned. Don't make it sound like that. Family helps family. We can strengthen your brand, expand it internationally. With my connections and your creativity. With your name on my work, I interrupted. He froze the sentence unfinished. Eleanor tried to interject. Sweetheart, your father just wants to help, no? Eleanor, I said, my voice sharp but controlled. He wants to rewrite history. Pretend he believed in me all along. But he didn't. None of you did. Evan leaned forward, his tone shifting from annoyance to something meaner. Oh, come on. You act like you've had it so hard. You left because you wanted to, not because you had to. You always played the victim. I met his eyes, steady and cold. You mean the victim who turned a basement into a brand that Forbes calls revolutionary? He flinched but didn't answer. Around the table, the others avoided my gaze, aunts who'd once mocked me, uncles who used to ask when I'd get a real job. They were all suddenly fascinated by their plates. It would have been satisfying to gloat, to throw every cruel word back at them. But as I looked around the room, I realized something: they weren't worth my rage anymore. They'd spent years measuring worth in money, titles, and appearances. They'd built their identities on shallow foundations. Mine had been forged in the dirt, in the nights no one saw, in the struggle they mocked. And that difference, that was the real victory. I picked up my glass, swirling the golden liquid until reflections trembled across the rim. You know, I said softly, I used to sit at this table and feel like I was made of glass, fragile, see-through, breakable. But now I understand something. Dad's eyes narrowed. And what's that? Glass doesn't just break, I said. It also reflects. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Every one of them knew exactly what I meant. Evan shifted uncomfortably, tapping his fork against his plate. You really think you're better than us now, don't you? I smiled faintly. No. I just stopped needing you to tell me I'm enough. He laughed once, short, bitter, hollow. Well, congratulations, Clara. You've built your empire. Enjoy it. But don't forget who raised you. I set the glass down, leaning slightly forward. You're right. I won't forget. I'll remember exactly who told me I was wasting my life and how it felt when they laughed at me. The words landed clean. Eleanor covered her mouth. Dad's face hardened again, trying to reclaim his old authority. That's enough, Clara. Don't ruin this evening. This evening was ruined a long time ago, I said quietly. You just never noticed because I was the only one bleeding. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The motion sent a tremor through the room. Fear, guilt, pride all tangled together. And then from the far end of the table, a small voice spoke. I always believed in you. It was Lily, my cousin's teenage daughter, sitting quietly beside her mother. She looked at me with wide, sincere eyes. I followed your brand online. You made me want to design too. For a moment, my throat tightened. I smiled at her, a real one this time. Then you should, I said softly. Don't let anyone tell you you can't. The room fell even quieter after that. Dad sat back down slowly, his shoulders heavy, his voice low. Maybe we were wrong, he said. Maybe, I said gently. Dad, you weren't wrong about my choices. You were wrong about my worth. He didn't answer. For a while, no one did. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater and the ticking clock above the fireplace. Then I stood, smoothing my jacket. Thank you for dinner, I said. It was enlightening. Eleanor's eyes glistened. Clara, please. I shook my head. Don't worry. I'll see you again soon. Maybe next Christmas. Maybe at the next feature launch. Evan scoffed quietly. You think you're too good for us now? No, I said, pausing at the doorway. I just finally know I never needed your permission to be great. I left before anyone could respond. The cold night air hit me like freedom. The stars above the quiet street shimmered like the tiny flecks of silver on the Larev logo, mine, all mine. Behind me, through the dining room window, I could still see them frozen small, their world cracked open. I climbed into the old Civic, the engine coughing once before humming to life, and smiled to myself. They had finally seen me. But the best part, they couldn't unsee it now. By the time I stepped outside, the night had deepened into that velvet darkness that only winter brings, the kind that makes every sound sharper. The house behind me glowed warm, but I didn't look back. My heels clicked softly against the stone walkway as I headed toward my car, the old Civic that had carried me through every season of struggle. My phone buzzed as I reached for the door handle. I glanced down a new notification. Forbes. Inside the mind of Clara Bennett, the woman who redefined luxury. Below it, a flood of messages, journalists requesting interviews, brand collaborations, congratulatory notes from designers who once ignored my emails. I scrolled through them briefly, then locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I didn't need the validation anymore. The world finally knew. The next morning, the story was everywhere. My name on headlines, my face in glossy spreads, my designs photographed in immaculate detail. Larev had become the name everyone was suddenly trying to pronounce correctly. At the studio, my staff buzzed with excitement. Clara, did you see Vogue's tweet? One of them shouted. They called you the future of American design. I smiled without warmth, faintly. Then I guess the future's finally here. Vivian arrived not long after, her usual calm wrapped around her like silk. Well, she said, setting her bag down, looks like you've made quite the impression. I laughed softly. You told me I'd have to step into the light eventually. I did, she said, eyes glinting. I just didn't expect you to blind them all at once. Her words lingered in the air, pride mixed with something gentler, something that felt like love. But even as the world celebrated, I couldn't stop thinking about last night, the stunned faces, the half-hearted apologies, the silence that fell over that dinner table like a shroud. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. They hadn't just doubted me, they'd erased me. And now that they couldn't anymore, they were scrambling to rewrite the story. By noon, the first message came. Harold, your article looks incredible. We're proud of you. Let's talk soon. Then another, Eleanor. The neighbors have been calling all morning. Everyone's amazed. We want to celebrate with you this weekend. Dinner again. And finally, the one I expected but dreaded the most. Evan. Guess I underestimated you. Let's talk about partnership. We could do something powerful together. Family brand meets the global market. Call me. I stared at the texts for a long moment, then typed a single reply to all three. I'm busy. Maybe later. Then I turned the phone off. The rest of the day passed in a blur, meetings, phone calls, endless congratulations. By evening, I sat alone in my office, the city lights glowing against the tall windows. The skyline stretched endlessly, glittering like the promise of everything I'd once been told I couldn't have. Vivian knocked lightly before entering. You're still here, she said. I nodded, couldn't leave. It feels strange to stop. She studied me for a moment before sitting across from me. You did what few ever do. You built something that outgrew the people who tried to contain you. I thought it would feel different, I admitted. Like victory. It is victory, she said softly. But the sweetest kind of revenge isn't loud, Clara. It's quiet. It's when your silence says everything they refuse to hear. Her words hit sharp and I felt my throat tighten. Do you think they'll ever really see me for who I am? Vivian smiled faintly. They already did last night. They just don't know how to live with it yet. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. I didn't do it to prove them wrong, I said. At least not anymore. I know, she said. You did it to prove yourself right. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the city below. Then quietly, Vivian reached into her bag and placed a small wrapped box on the desk. "What's this?" I asked. "An anniversary gift," she said. 5 years since you started Le Rêve." I smiled. "You remembered?" "Of course," she said. "I was there when you had nothing but sketches and faith." I unwrapped the box carefully. Inside was a silver key, sleek and simple. "To your new headquarters," she said. "Downtown. Triple the space. It's time you stopped thinking small." The weight of it in my palm felt symbolic, a physical reminder of how far I'd come. "Vivian, thank you." She stood straightening her coat. "Don't thank me. Just keep building. That's how you honor the journey." When she left, I sat there in the quiet, the key gleaming in my hand. The city outside was alive, people rushing home, lights flickering in office towers, taxis threading through the streets. I could almost see my reflection in the glass. The girl who once sewed shoes under a single streetlight, and the woman whose reflection no longer waited for approval. Same hands, different world. I drove home late that night, exhaustion setting in only after the adrenaline wore off. My phone buzzed again, another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Lily. They're talking about you on TV. Even Dad can't stop watching. He looks like he swallowed a lemon." I smiled. "My young cousin. Thanks for telling me," I wrote back. "How's your design sketch coming along?" Her reply came seconds later. "Almost done. I'm naming it the Clara Boot." I laughed quietly alone in the car and felt a stillness settle in my core. By the next morning, I was everywhere. News outlets, interviews, even talk shows wanted me. My assistant burst into my office breathless. CNN just called. They want a live interview about women entrepreneurs in fashion. I took the phone from her hand, hesitating only for a moment before saying yes. The interview was live that evening. Under the soft studio lights, the host smiled warmly. "Clara, your story has inspired millions. What do you think success truly means?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Success isn't about proving anyone wrong," I said finally. "It's about building something so true to yourself that no one's opinion can touch it." When I was younger, I thought revenge would be the victory. But now I know release is. When the segment aired, the internet exploded with messages of support. The Clara effect began trending. Brands I'd admired for years reached out for collaborations. And yet, in the midst of it all, I couldn't shake one thought: my family was watching. That night, my phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail from my father, Harold Bennett. I almost didn't listen, but curiosity won. "Clara," his voice said, rougher than I remembered. "I saw your interview. You sounded strong. You've built something incredible. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." There was a long pause, then quieter. "You were right about everything." The message ended there. I sat for a long time staring at the skyline, the city's pulse matching my own. For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry or hurt. I just felt free. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of winter through the open window. Somewhere far below, a woman walked past in a pair of Le Rêve heels, confident, graceful, unstoppable. I smiled. The reckoning wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And it felt like peace dressed in victory. The following week, I found myself standing in front of the same house where my story had begun, the same white columns, the same immaculate porch, the same illusion of perfection. My father Harold had called again, his voice measured, polite, almost rehearsed. "Come for Sunday dinner," he said. "Let's celebrate properly. The family wants to see you." A year ago, those words would have tightened something in my chest. Now they barely registered. I agreed, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I wanted to see what happened when people who once looked down on me were forced to look up. When I walked into the dining room, it was like stepping into a play where the actors had changed their lines but not their faces. The table shimmered with precision. But something was different. The laughter was strained, the smiles practiced. Clara Eleanor exclaimed, rising to greet me. "You look radiant." Evan stood too, his grin a touch too wide. There she is, our very own celebrity CEO. I set my coat over the chair and smiled without warmth. It's just Clara. Dad poured me a glass of wine himself, a gesture I couldn't remember seeing before. You've made quite a name for yourself, he said. We've been following everything. Your expansion in Paris, impressive work. Thank you, I said simply. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was almost nostalgic, the same silence that used to suffocate me when I was disappointed at the table. But this time, I wasn't the one shrinking beneath it. Evan broke the tension first, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. I've been thinking, Clara, he began, his tone overly casual. Your brand's growing fast. My firm has experience managing international logistics. We could help streamline your operations. I took a sip of wine, hiding a smile. We already have a global logistics team, Evan. He chuckled awkwardly. Of course you do. I'm just saying, family working together, it's a strong look for the press. Maybe we can, Dad interrupted, his voice too smooth. I think what your brother means is that collaboration could strengthen our family legacy. We could invest in Le Rêve. You could even open a line under the Bennett name. The irony almost made me laugh. Years ago, he told me that selling shoes was a waste of time, that I was embarrassing the family. Now he wanted to brand my life's work with his name. I leaned back, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I appreciate the offer, I said evenly. But Le Rêve doesn't need investors. And it certainly doesn't need a Bennett label. Dad's jaw tightened. You'd turn down a family. I'm not turning down a family, I said. I'm setting boundaries. Evan's smirk faltered. Eleanor cleared her throat. Darling, you've worked so hard. Why not let your father help? He has experience with control, I asked softly. Her face fell. I glanced around the table. Every face that once looked at me with superiority now watched me carefully, unsure how to navigate the reversal. When I left this house, I continued, you all made it clear I was on my own. You mocked me for chasing something small. You called my dream a hobby. Now that it's big, suddenly it's worth your attention. Evan bristled. You don't have to make this about old grudges. It's not a grudge, I said. It's a reminder. The words landed clean. My father's hand tightened around his wine glass. Clara, we only wanted what was best for you. No, I said quietly. You wanted what was safest for you. You didn't want me to fail because it would embarrass you. You didn't want me to succeed because it would challenge you. He flinched. The silence afterward was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, he set his glass down with a sharp clink. So this is what success looks like to you, arrogance? No, I said, standing. This is what dignity looks like. For a moment, no one moved. Then Eleanor reached across the table, her voice trembling. Clara, please. We were wrong, okay? We see it now. You've become everything we didn't think you could. Can't that be enough? I looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't the villain of my story. She was just someone who'd been too afraid to believe in something she couldn't control. I forgive you, I said softly. But I don't owe you access to what I built without you. Her hand dropped. Evan pushed back his chair. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said. It just means I stopped needing to be smaller so you could feel bigger. Dad's face turned red, his voice breaking through the quiet. You've forgotten where you came from. I met his eyes steadily. No, Dad. You just never imagined I could go somewhere you couldn't follow. The room went still again, no defense, no counter. Just the slow, unsteady breathing of people who had finally lost their place in the story. Then Lily. My young cousin spoke up from the corner of the table. Aunt Clara, she said timidly, I want to be like you when I grow up. The room froze. I smiled at her gently. Then promise me something, I said. Promise you'll never let anyone tell you that your dream is too small. She nodded earnestly, her eyes bright. For the first time that night, the sting of tears surprised me. I turned back to my father. You once told me I'd never be rich selling shoes, I said. You were right because I wasn't selling shoes. I was building something no one in this house could see: freedom. His mouth opened, then closed again. I reached for my coat. I should go. Early flight tomorrow. Paris collection. No one stopped me. Not this time. As I walked out, I paused by the doorway. The light spilled across the table, catching the rim of my wine glass left half full. You know, I said softly the funny thing about glass ceilings. They look just like dinner tables from below. The door closed behind me before anyone could reply. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of apple pie and something bittersweet like endings that had taken too long to arrive. I stood by my car for a moment, staring up at the sky. The same stars I'd once wished on now shimmered like old friends. When I started the engine, the reflection of the house glowed in my rearview mirror, smaller, dimmer, just a memory. The tables had finally turned. And this time, I was the one who got to walk away first. The plane touched down in Paris, just as the sun began to rise over the Seine, spilling pale gold light across the clouds. From my window seat, the city shimmered like something out of a dream, old and new history and ambition intertwined. It had been years since I'd first imagined this moment, and yet now that it was here, it wasn't victory, it was release. When I stepped off the plane, my team was waiting, cameras, reporters, a few familiar faces from Le Rêve, Paris. They cheered as I walked through the terminal, the sound echoing softly against the marble walls. "Clara Bennett," someone shouted. "How does it feel to lead the most influential luxury brand of the year?" I smiled without warmth, politely. "It feels like we're just getting started." Later, standing inside the new flagship boutique, I let my hand brush across the rows of shoes displayed beneath soft, golden lights. The leather was smooth, the designs elegant, a far cry from the scraps of fabric I used to sew in a cramped studio. I could still remember the scent of effort, the sting of exhaustion, the hunger that wasn't just for food but for recognition. Now the same hands that once trembled over a broken sewing machine were signing international contracts. Vivian arrived mid-morning, her usual calm radiating warmth. "The press conference starts at 10, she said. "You ready?" I turned toward the mirror, adjusting my blazer. "For once," I said with a genuine smile, "I think I am." When I stepped onto the small stage inside the boutique, flashbulbs flared and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked, capturing every gesture, every breath. 5 years ago, I began my voice steady. I was stitching prototypes in a basement, selling shoes out of my car, and living off instant noodles. Everyone told me it wouldn't work, that no one wanted luxury from someone who looked like me, who started with nothing. But here's the truth. Luxury isn't about where you come from. It's about what you build. Applause filled the room, but I kept going. To every young designer, every dreamer who's ever been told they're aiming too high, remember this. The people who doubt you are just confirming how big your dream really is. I saw Vivian smile in the crowd. I saw a few tears. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't speaking to an audience, I was speaking for them. When the event ended, I walked out into the street, the Paris air cool against my face. The city moved around me, cars chatter the rhythm of life, unbothered by fame or fortune. I took a deep breath. For the first time, the noise inside me finally stilled. That evening, I sat alone on the balcony of my hotel suite, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. Below, the city shimmered with precision. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, messages from my team, from partners, from people who wanted interviews. But one message stood out, Harold. I hesitated before opening it. "I watched your speech. I'm proud of you, Clara. Truly. Eleanor and I talked about everything you said. We were wrong. You didn't just make shoes. You made something beautiful out of the very thing we used to mock. I'm sorry for not believing in you when it mattered most. Love, Harold." I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a moment. I didn't cry, not this time. The forgiveness had already happened inside me long before the apology arrived. But reading it now felt like closing the final chapter of an old book. I typed a short reply. "Thank you, Harold. I'm glad you see it now." Then I turned my phone off. As the night deepened, I found myself thinking about all the dinners I'd endured, all the scornful laughter that held unconcealed contempt. Now the silence felt healing. I thought of Lily, her bright eyes, and that small voice saying she wanted to design like me. Maybe that was the real point of all this, not revenge, not recognition, but inspiration. Somewhere someone was sitting in a tiny room sketching a dream onto paper, thinking it was too small to matter. I wanted them to see this story and know it mattered. Every start matters. A soft knock pulled me from my thoughts. Vivian stepped out onto the balcony with 2 glasses of champagne. "We're officially sold out in 3 countries," she said, handing me one. "Here's to Le Rêve." I raised my glass. Here's to beginnings disguised as endings. We clinked glasses, the sound crisp against the hum of the city. Vivian studied me for a moment. "Do you ever miss the old days?" I smiled. "The hunger. The doubt, ramen sometimes. They made me who I am." She nodded. "And who's that now?" I looked out over the glittering cityscape, the tower glowing like fire against the night. Someone who doesn't need to be seen to know she's shining. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that feels full rather than empty. Eventually, Vivian rose. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's another big day." After she left, I leaned back in the chair, letting the cool wind tangle through my hair. Below, the city pulsed alive, unstoppable. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life. To the struggle, the loneliness, the nights I almost quit. To every no that made the yes mean something. The next morning, I walked through the boutique before it opened. The floor smelled faintly of leather and possibility. My reflection no longer waited for approval in the mirrored walls. I stopped at one display, a simple pair of ivory heels, sleek and minimal. The small gold plate beneath read, "The Bennett." I smiled. It wasn't vanity. It was closed. As I stepped outside into the Paris morning, I saw a group of young women taking photos near the storefront. One of them turned, gasped, and whispered, "It's her." They waved, unsure if they should approach. I walked over, smiling. "Are you designers?" One of them nodded shyly. "Trying to be." "Then don't try," I said softly. "Be." They grinned, eyes wide, as I walked away down the cobblestone street. The wind carried their laughter behind me, light, hopeful, unburdened. And for the first time I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of someone else's. As the bells of Notre Dame chimed in the distance, I glanced up at the sky, endless, bright, and wide open. I turned the corner, the sound of the city wrapping around me like applause, quiet but infinite. And that's when I smiled. Not the practiced one, not the one built for survival, but the one that meant I was finally free.